440.9 kilograms. That is the exact IAEA recorded quantity of uranium enriched to 60% U-235, a hair's breadth from weapons grade that the world's nuclear watchdog has not been permitted to physically verify in more than 12 consecutive monthly inspection cycles. Iran is, by the IAEA's own formal designation, the only non-nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to have ever produced and accumulated material at this enrichment level. And Iran's own government has spent the past several months giving contradictory answers about where that material actually is. This is the confirmed, sourced account of that contradiction, and why it may be Tehran's own doing. A brief note on standing before the details. This analysis draws on a background as a former combat fighter pilot, F-15E, and F-16 with the Air Force's Air Demonstration Squadron, followed by years flying commercial aircraft. That background informs the technical judgments throughout. Every claim that follows is sourced to a named official, an IAEA report, or documented reporting, and every disputed or speculative claim is identified as such rather than folded into the confirmed record, no matter how much more dramatic the unqualified version would sound. Start with the number itself, because precision matters enormously in a story about nuclear material. The IAEA's last formal custody document for Iran's enriched uranium, designated GOV-2026-8 and dated February 27, 2026, recorded 440. 9 kilograms of uranium hexafluoride enriched to 60% U-235, alongside an additional 184. 1 kilograms enriched up to 20%. Those measurements were taken before Operation Midnight Hammer struck Iran's enrichment infrastructure in June of last year. The 60% material is what drives the actual proliferation concern here, because relatively little additional technical effort separates uranium enriched to that level from the weapons grade threshold. Here's why that specific percentage matters so much, stated plainly. Natural uranium contains less than 1% of the U-235 isotope needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Reactor-grade fuel typically requires enrichment to roughly 3 to 5%. Weapons-grade material generally starts around 90%. The technical distance between 60% and weapons grade is considerably smaller in terms of the additional centrifuge work required than the distance between natural uranium and 60% in the first place. That's the specific reason arms control experts treat a 60% stockpile as a genuine, near-term proliferation threshold, rather than simply one data point among many in a broader enrichment program. Put the scale of that stockpile in even more concrete terms. Arms control analysts have separately estimated that Iran's expanded enrichment capacity, combined with its existing stockpiles, had reduced the country's breakout time, the time required to produce enough weapons-grade material for an actual bomb, to less than 2 weeks as of late 2024, with enough material on hand at that point for potentially 5 to 6 separate weapons. That estimate predates the strikes discussed throughout this breakdown, but it establishes the baseline scale of concern driving every subsequent verification demand. This was never a marginal or merely symbolic stockpile. It was, by outside expert calculation, already sufficient for multiple weapons, before any of the events covered in the rest of this analysis even occurred. Now to the verification requirement itself, because this is where Iran's own conduct becomes the actual story. Under the IAEA's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, any stockpile enriched above 20% requires physical verification at least once every 30 days. As of the most recent published analysis, that 440 9-kilogram stockpile had gone unverified for more than 12 consecutive monthly cycles, a gap extending well beyond even the roughly 97-day inspector access blackout period documented separately, encompassing essentially the entire post-strike period since Midnight Hammer. 12 missed verification cycles against a legal requirement of 1 every 30 days is not a minor administrative lapse. It is a sustained, ongoing violation of a specific binding safeguards obligation. The 30-day requirement exists for a specific, deliberate technical reason worth understanding. Material enriched above 20% sits close enough to weapons-usable thresholds that international monitors need frequent enough verification to detect any diversion, further enrichment, or unauthorized movement of the stockpile before it could meaningfully progress toward weaponization without being noticed. A monthly check is not an arbitrary bureaucratic cadence. It's calibrated specifically against how quickly a state with existing enrichment infrastructure could plausibly advance a stockpile at this level toward weapons-grade material if left unmonitored. 12 consecutive missed cycles isn't just a compliance gap measured in calendar time. It represents 12 separate windows during which, from the IAEA's perspective, virtually anything could have happened to that material without any independent confirmation either way. The IAEA's own Director General has stated this concern in his own words, on the record. Rafael Grossi told Sputnik directly, so the general impression is that the material is still there, of course, from our point of view. In order to affirm this, we need to go back and inspect and check that everything is there. So we haven't done this, but there is a reasonable impression that this material is there at the moment. Read that quote carefully, because the precision of his language is doing real work. Reasonable impression is explicitly not the same as verified confirmation. Grossi is telling you plainly that the IAEA believes the material likely remains in Iran, while simultaneously stating just as plainly that this belief has not been physically confirmed through actual inspection. Notice also what Grossi did not say in that quote, because the omission is as informative as the content itself. He did not say the IAEA has intelligence suggesting the material was moved. He did not say Iran has provided any updated declaration. He specifically described an impression, a working assessment based on the absence of contrary evidence rather than positive confirmation, which is a meaningfully weaker epistemic position than the kind of confident, verified accounting the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement is actually designed to produce. An international body reduced to describing its confidence in a near weapons-grade stockpile's location as a reasonable impression, rather than a verified fact, is itself the clearest possible evidence of how significant this access gap has become. The Institute for Science and International Security's own analysis of the IAEA's June 2026 Safeguards Report reinforces exactly this same gap. That report presents a picture of near total ongoing loss of monitoring of Iranian nuclear sites due to Iran's suspension of access nearly a year ago, an unaccounted for enriched uranium stockpile, and key activities that cannot be verified. The IAEA's own report states directly, Iran is the only NPT non-nuclear weapon state to have produced and accumulated uranium enriched up to 60% U-235, and describes the agency's lack of access to verify the previously declared HEU and LEU for nearly a year, as a matter of proliferation concern and of compliance with the NPT Safeguards Agreement. That is about as unambiguous a formal international finding as exists in this entire story. It's worth being precise about what that specific formal designation, the only NPT non-nuclear weapon state to have produced and accumulated material at this level, actually establishes. Every other country that has ever enriched uranium to 60% or beyond has done so either as a declared nuclear weapon state under the treaty's own framework or entirely outside the NPT system altogether. Iran occupies a unique, singular category, a state that formally committed, through treaty membership, not to pursue nuclear weapons, while simultaneously becoming the only such state ever recorded producing material at a concentration this close to weapons grade. That singularity is not incidental background context, it's the specific technical fact that explains why this particular verification gap generates so much more international concern than a comparable gap involving a lower enrichment stockpile would. Now here is where Iran's own public statements start to genuinely contradict each other, and this is the heart of the mistake this video's title refers to. Iran's foreign minister, Sayed Abbas Araghchi, stated on March 15, 2026, that the country's enriched uranium is, in his words, under the rubble, created by the June 2025 attacks on Iran's enrichment facilities. He added that Iran has no plan to recover this material. That is a specific, on-the-record claim from Iran's own top diplomat, made directly to explain why the material cannot currently be verified, buried, inaccessible, and by Iran's own admission, not something the government intends to dig out. Consider what that specific claim was designed to accomplish diplomatically when it was made. A stockpile that's genuinely buried under collapsed infrastructure, with no active plan to recover it, is, from a proliferation standpoint, considerably less alarming than one that remains fully intact and accessible. If true, that framing would actually work in Iran's favor internationally, suggesting the material poses a diminished near-term threat regardless of the ongoing verification gap, since inaccessible material can't easily be diverted, further enriched, or weaponized on any meaningful timeline. That's precisely why the specific wording, buried, no plan to recover, functions as a form of reassurance dressed up as an explanation for the access denial. But on that exact same day, in an interview with CBS Face the Nation, Araghchi told Margaret Brennan something that sits in real tension with the buried and unrecoverable framing. I offered, actually, that we are ready to dilute those enriched material, or downblend them, as they say, into lower percentage. So that was a big offer, a big concession. Sit with that specific contradiction for a moment. A government cannot simultaneously and credibly claim its enriched uranium is buried under rubble with no plan to recover it, while also offering, as a serious diplomatic concession, in the same set of statements, to actively dilute that exact material into a lower, less concerning enrichment percentage. Diluting material requires physically accessing it. You cannot downblend uranium you claim is unreachable under a collapsed structure. Walk through the actual mechanics of downblending for a moment, because understanding the physical process makes the contradiction even sharper. Downblending, or diluting enriched uranium, is a deliberate chemical and physical process, mixing highly enriched material with natural or depleted uranium to reduce its overall U-235 concentration to a lower, less proliferation-sensitive level. That process requires specialized facilities, physical handling of the material itself, and typically international supervision to verify the dilution was actually carried out as declared. None of that is remotely compatible with material genuinely buried under the rubble of a destroyed enrichment facility with no recovery plan. Offering to downblend material implies, by definition, that the material is physically reachable, transportable, and processable, exactly the opposite of what the buried framing was designed to convey just hours earlier in the same news cycle. That is not a minor rhetorical slip. It is a direct, self-generated inconsistency, made by the same official on the same day in two separate public statements. And it is precisely the kind of inconsistency that international observers, IAEA inspectors, and rival intelligence services are trained to notice immediately, because it suggests one of two things. Either the buried and unrecoverable framing was a diplomatic exaggeration designed to explain away the lack of IAEA access without admitting the material may actually be intact and accessible, or the offer to dilute it was itself a negotiating gesture not fully grounded in Iran's actual physical capability to follow through. Either explanation represents a serious, self-inflicted credibility problem, not something imposed on Iran from outside. It's worth naming both possible explanations for that contradiction explicitly and fairly, since this breakdown isn't going to pretend to know which one is actually correct. The first possibility, that the buried framing was strategic exaggeration, would mean Iran deliberately understated its own access to the material, specifically to explain away the ongoing verification gap without admitting the material remains fully under its control. The second possibility, that the downblending offer was itself not fully grounded in physical reality, would mean Araghchi made a diplomatic gesture during a sensitive negotiation that outpaced what Iran's own government could technically deliver on if actually pressed to follow through. Both explanations are plausible, given the confirmed statements alone, and distinguishing between them would require exactly the kind of physical IAEA verification access that remains, as of this recording, still unrestored. Now to a specific, more speculative theory, worth including precisely because it's been circulating in defense-focused analysis while being treated with the caution its sourcing actually warrants. One independent analytical piece, published by the outlet House of Saud, has argued that if a relocation occurred as assessed, Operation Midnight Hammer destroyed Iran's enrichment production infrastructure, centrifuge halls, chemical laboratories, a uranium conversion plant, metallurgy facilities, while the actual highly enriched uranium inventory was already moved elsewhere beforehand. That same analysis points to satellite imagery from June 9, 2025, showing a convoy heading toward the southern entrance of an underground tunnel complex near the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center, a complex that same analysis states was not included in the Israeli strike points from Operation Rising Lion, which occurred 4 days later. If that specific sequence of events is accurate, satellite-documented convoy movement toward an underground tunnel entrance, followed 4 days later by strikes that hit the above-ground enrichment infrastructure, but left that specific tunnel complex untouched, it would represent a genuinely significant alternative explanation for the entire verification gap. It would mean the strikes destroyed Iran's capacity to produce additional enriched material, but never actually targeted the existing inventory itself, because that inventory had already been moved to a location outside the confirmed target set before the strikes ever occurred. Under that specific scenario, the material was never buried under any rubble at all, contradicting Araghchi's own framing from an entirely different direction than the downblending inconsistency already discussed. I want to be extremely precise about how much weight this specific theory deserves. This is a single outlet's independent analytical interpretation of satellite imagery and strike timing, not an IAEA finding, not a US or Israeli government statement, and not something corroborated by any of the other 6 sources in this breakdown. It is presented here because it represents a genuinely circulating explanation for why the stockpile remains unverified, and because it would, if accurate, mean the material was never actually destroyed or buried at all, directly undercutting Araghchi's own under the rubble framing from an entirely different angle. But this breakdown is treating it explicitly as one analyst's interpretation of imagery, not as an established fact, and you should weigh it accordingly. It's worth explaining exactly why this particular kind of claim is so difficult to independently verify from publicly available information, since that difficulty is itself informative about how this story might eventually get resolved, or fail to. Satellite imagery of a convoy moving toward a tunnel entrance establishes that vehicles moved in that direction on that specific date. It does not, on its own, establish what those vehicles were carrying, whether the movement was connected to the enriched uranium stockpile specifically, or whether the tunnel complex in question actually has the technical capacity to safely store material of this kind long term. Confirming any of those additional details would require either direct IAEA access to that specific site, corroborating intelligence from a government source willing to go on the record, or additional satellite and open source analysis from independent researchers, cross-referencing this same imagery. None of those additional confirmation layers currently exist in the public record, which is exactly why this theory remains, for now, a plausible but unconfirmed explanation rather than an established fact. Notice how this relocation theory, even though it's unconfirmed, actually interacts with the Aragchi contradiction discussed earlier. If the relocation theory is accurate, it would mean Aragchi's under the rubble statement was straightforwardly false, not merely diplomatically imprecise, since the material would never have been anywhere near the destroyed infrastructure in the first place. If the relocation theory is not accurate and the material genuinely was affected by the strikes to some degree, then Aragchi's downblending offer becomes the more puzzling of the two statements instead. Either way, at least one of Iran's own two contradictory public claims about this exact stockpile does not hold up against the other, regardless of which specific external theory about the material's actual physical status turns out to be correct. Now the analytical portion, clearly marked as such, addressing exactly what mistake means in this specific context. Whether or not Iran's leadership intended for any of this to happen, the confirmed, documented outcome is that Iran has spent nearly a year as the only NPT non-nuclear weapon state ever found to have produced 60% enriched uranium, while simultaneously blocking the one mechanism, physical IAEA verification, that could actually resolve the international suspicion surrounding that material. Every month that verification gap continues, Iran's own government bears the direct, primary responsibility for the resulting uncertainty, regardless of whether the material is genuinely buried, genuinely relocated, or sitting exactly where it was last formally recorded. Consider the strategic logic, or lack of it, behind maintaining that verification gap for this long. If Iran's underlying goal is to reduce international pressure and eventually secure sanctions relief through renewed negotiations, an unverified, ambiguous nuclear stockpile is close to the worst possible bargaining position available. It provides no leverage that a clearly declared, internationally monitored stockpile wouldn't also provide, while actively inviting the maximum possible suspicion from every government and intelligence service tracking this exact question. A transparently verified stockpile, even a large and concerning one, at least allows negotiating partners to calculate risk based on known facts. An unverified, ambiguous one forces every outside party to assume worst-case scenarios by default, which is precisely the dynamic that has kept military pressure, including the sustained strike campaign covered extensively elsewhere in this coverage, as a live option on the table for the United States and Israel throughout this entire period. There's a useful comparison here to how uncertainty functions in any high-stakes negotiation, not just nuclear diplomacy specifically. In most negotiating contexts, a party benefits from controlled ambiguity when it can selectively reveal information to its own advantage, while denying opponents a full picture. But nuclear verification doesn't work that way, because the entire international framework built around the NPT and IAEA safeguard system is specifically designed so that ambiguity itself, regardless of the true underlying facts, triggers escalating countermeasures, sanctions, military posturing, diplomatic isolation. Iran isn't simply facing skepticism about a specific claim, it's operating inside a system explicitly engineered to treat unverified nuclear material as inherently more dangerous than verified material of the exact same composition, which means the verification gap itself, independent of whatever the physical truth turns out to be, is actively generating costs Iran has no comparable mechanism to offset. That specific dynamic, ambiguity inviting worst-case assumptions rather than reducing pressure, is arguably the single clearest, most defensible reading of what the mistake in this story's title actually refers to. It is not necessarily a claim that Iran deliberately, strategically chose to create this exact situation. It is an observation that whatever combination of destroyed infrastructure, genuine access difficulty, and deliberate diplomatic positioning produced this outcome, the resulting reality, a self-perpetuated verification vacuum around exactly the material the rest of the world is most worried about, serves Iran's own stated diplomatic objectives considerably worse than a transparent, verified accounting would. There's also a direct connection here to the broader war and blockade dynamics covered extensively in prior breakdowns of this conflict. Every one of Iran's public statements about diplomatic willingness, whether Araghchi's downblending offer, Ghalibaf's negotiating positions on the Strait of Hormuz, or any future overture toward renewed talks, gets evaluated by American and international counterparts against the backdrop of this specific, unresolved uranium verification gap. A negotiating partner offering concessions on shipping or infrastructure while simultaneously maintaining an unverified near-weapons-grade uranium stockpile is going to face a fundamentally higher baseline of skepticism than one without that specific complication attached, regardless of how genuine any individual diplomatic offer actually is. That baseline skepticism effect is worth naming explicitly as its own distinct cost, separate from any specific sanctions or military consequence. Diplomatic negotiations depend heavily on each party's assessment of the other's good faith and internal consistency. A foreign minister, whose own public statements about the exact material at the center of these negotiations contradict each other within the same news cycle, gives every counterpart, whether skeptical hardliners in Washington or cautiously optimistic mediators in Doha, direct, citable evidence to discount future statements from that same official, regardless of subject matter. That reputational cost compounds over time and extends well beyond the specific uranium question, potentially affecting how credibly Iran's negotiators are received on entirely separate issues, from shipping lane access to prisoner exchanges to broader sanctions relief discussions. It's also worth directly addressing what would actually resolve this specific mistake, if Iran's leadership chose to address it. Restoring IAEA access for a physical verification of the declared stockpile, whether that confirms the material remains in its original location, confirms a relocation to a different declared site, or confirms some portion was genuinely destroyed or rendered inaccessible during the strikes, would immediately close the credibility gap currently working against Iran's own diplomatic interests. The technical act of verification itself doesn't require Iran to make any additional substantive concession beyond what its own comprehensive safeguards agreement obligations already require. The fact that this specific, relatively low-cost step toward rebuilding credibility has not happened for over a year is itself the clearest evidence available that something beyond simple logistics is driving the continued access denial. What to watch next, framed as open questions rather than predictions. First, whether Iran restores IAEA access sufficient to conduct the required physical verification, which remains the single most direct, unambiguous resolution available to this entire story, and the clearest possible signal of genuine diplomatic intent if it happens. Watch specifically for any announced timeline or partial access arrangement, since even a limited, phased restoration would represent a meaningful shift from the current total access denial that has now persisted for nearly a year. Second, whether any independent satellite imagery or intelligence reporting further corroborates or contradicts the House of Saud analysis's relocation theory, since additional independent corroboration would meaningfully change how much weight that specific, currently single-sourced claim deserves. A second, independently conducted imagery analysis, reaching a similar conclusion, would substantially strengthen the theory's credibility, while a contradicting analysis or an official denial would appropriately weaken it. Third, whether Araghchi or another senior Iranian official addresses the direct contradiction between the buried and unrecoverable framing and the offer to dilute the material, since a clarification in either direction would resolve one of the most significant credibility gaps documented in this breakdown. The specific manner of any clarification, whether it walks back one of the two original statements or attempts to reconcile them, would itself be informative about which explanation for the underlying contradiction is more likely accurate. And fourth, whether the IAEA's next quarterly safeguards report shows any change in verification status, given that each additional missed 30-day cycle further extends what is already a documented, ongoing violation of Iran's own safeguards obligations. A report showing restored access, even partial, would represent the single clearest, most authoritative resolution available to the entire uncertainty this breakdown has documented. Each of those four threads has a concrete, checkable answer likely to emerge as this story continues developing. And tracking them individually, rather than accepting either Iran's own contradictory framing or unconfirmed speculation about relocation at face value, is what will actually clarify where this near-weapons-grade stockpile actually stands. A note on sourcing. This breakdown draws on 7 identifiable sources. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi's direct statement to Sputnik regarding the reasonable impression but unverified status of the stockpile. The Institute for Science and International Security's analysis of the IAEA's June 2026 Safeguards and Verification reports, the Congressional Research Service's report on Iran and nuclear weapons production, including Araghchi's under the rubble statement, and the IAEA's specific 440, 9 and 184. 1 kilogram figures, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation's documentation of Araghchi's CBS Face the Nation interview, and his downblending offer, the World Nuclear Association's technical background on Iran's enrichment program, and IAEA access history, the Arms Control Association's fact sheet on Iran's nuclear program status and breakout timeline estimates, and the House of Saud analytical piece presenting the tunnel relocation theory explicitly flagged throughout as a single outlet's independent interpretation, rather than a confirmed government or IAEA finding. Each source is weighted according to its own nature. An IAEA formal report, or a Director General's on the record statement, is treated as the most authoritative confirmed fact available. A named official's public statement is treated as exactly that, their stated position. And the single-sourced relocation theory is treated explicitly as unconfirmed analytical speculation throughout. The World Nuclear Association's own technical background on this program adds useful additional context on just how long this specific access dispute has actually been building. The IAEA head told the agency's Board of Governors as early as March 2, 2026, that inspectors had not had access to Iran's previously declared inventories of low-enriched and high-enriched uranium for more than 8 months at that point, meaning the specific access gap now approaching or exceeding a full year did not appear suddenly. It has been an escalating, publicly documented concern for well over a year when measured from its actual starting point rather than from any single recent headline. 3 things before this concludes. Subscribe and enable notifications, because Iran's uranium verification status remains a live, unresolved international issue. And any restoration of IAEA access, or any further contradiction in Iran's own public statements about the material's location, deserves coverage as soon as it's confirmed, rather than assumed prematurely from a single, ambiguous signal. Like this video specifically because it identified a direct, documented contradiction in Iran's own senior diplomats' public statements, made on the same day, rather than simply repeating either claim uncritically, because it clearly separated the confirmed IAEA verification gap from the considerably more speculative relocation theory circulating in some analysis of this story. A dramatic headline about a nuclear mistake travels faster than a careful accounting of exactly which specific claims are confirmed and which remain speculative, but only the second version actually holds up against the underlying sourcing. And leave a comment on what deserves the next deep dive, whether that is a closer technical look at exactly what downblending uranium actually involves and why it would require physical access to the material. A deeper accounting of the full IAEA safeguards violation timeline since the original strikes, or continued tracking of whether Iran ever restores the physical inspection access this entire story ultimately depends on, because that feedback directly shapes what gets covered next. This concludes today's breakdown. Every figure and claim here reflects the most current, verifiable reporting available at the time of recording, and the specific claim that remains speculative, the tunnel relocation theory, has been treated throughout as a single analyst's interpretation rather than a confirmed fact, because that is what the actual sourcing supports. The confirmed story underneath the title, a documented ongoing safeguards violation, a Director General's own careful language distinguishing impression from verification, and a foreign minister's own statements directly contradicting each other on the same day, is substantial and genuinely consequential without needing anything beyond what's already on the record, whatever the true physical status of that 440. 9-kilogram stockpile actually turns out to be the verification gap surrounding it, and the contradictions Iran's own government has offered to explain that gap are the confirmed mistake this story is actually built on.